Welcome to the world of Telly.
Hi, I'm Neil.
And I'm John.
And you're listening to World of Telly, the podcast where John and I watch every single TV programme ever made in no particular order. And what are we watching this week, John?
A Very Peculiar Practice.
If you're unfamiliar with this programme, A Very Peculiar Practice was a 14-part comedy drama serial that was broadcast over 2 series on BBC Two on Wednesday nights in 1986 and 1988. It was written by Andrew Davies, produced by Ken Riddington and directed by David Tucker. It stars Peter Davison, David Troughton, Barbara Flynn and Graham Crowden. And I guess the person we need to start talking about first here, John, is the writer Andrew Davies. What can you tell us about him?
Andrew Davies, he's been around for so long. I think people sometimes forget that because his career really flourished quite late on, relatively speaking, that he was actually really, a contemporary of Dennis Potter. He was born a year after Dennis Potter. Howard Pinter was just 5 years before that. So he's very much of that generation. He wrote for radio first. When he was quite young, he got some commissions. And he got a Wednesday play in the late 60s. But then, as he himself pointed out, he didn't get anything else on TV for quite some time after that. So he kept thinking his career was going to kick off with the writing. But in fact, what he did do was worked as a teacher, then university lecturer, ending up at Warwick University. Indeed, he was still doing that when the first series of Very Peculiar Practice went out. Even when he wasn't that recognised, he was prolific, absolutely ridiculously prolific writer. He wrote radio, television plays, along, as I say, his day job. He was a children's author. He created the character of Marmalade Atkins, which later became a TV series. He wrote 2 series of what people of a certain age will remember very well, a series called Look and Read, a children's literacy program. But then he developed a flair for adaptations, and he did a really famous one, which was one of the Christmas ghost stories, which is an adaptation of The Signalman with Denham in it, based on the Dickens short story, which is still trotted out most Christmases now. And then he graduated into doing adaptations of large novels and serials. And the really successful one that I guess you would say really kicked him off was an adaptation of R.F. Elderfield's To Serve Them All My Days, starring John Deteen and others, which is about a kind of Goodbye Mr. Chips kind of story of a soldier invalided out in the First World War and his life and career at a public school. The thing I think that's really interesting about To Serve Them All My Days, apart from the fact that, speaking personally, I absolutely loved it, but it took a lot of liberties with the original novel. And I think Andrew Davies was a bit of a genius for taking sort of middle brow, I would say, not pejoratively, but what would be classed as middle brow material, and really adding to it. And even in the letters page of the Radio Times, there were people saying, why did you not let one of the daughters survive, and killed them all off? And Andrew Davies patiently explaining why it made it a better TV programme when he did these kind of things.
Now, there was a programme that he did in the early 80s called Heart Attack Hotel. And the interesting thing about this drama is that it sort of introduces us to the concept of the Andrew Davies multiverse.
Yeah, however you want to call it, the Davies Extended Universe, the multiverse in this case, I think is probably a reasonable thing to say, because he was still writing one-off plays around the time that he was doing these adaptations, like To Serve Them All My Days. And Heart Attack Hotel was a sort of Friday night BBC Two play, quite long, I remember. I saw it at the time. It's a very odd play about a hotel where sort of fat businessmen go. It's a bit like the French film Le Grand Bouffe, where some kind of like rich people eat themselves to death. They go to this hotel, they're fed really sort of heart attacky food, as the title suggests, but then also given strenuous exercise to do. It's a kind of slightly symbolic, macabre thing, but entering into this come along the characters Dr. Stephen Dacre and Lynn. And of course, they are the 2 lead characters of the first series of Very Peculiar Practice. Now, Stephen Dacre is played by an actor called Hugh Fraser, but Lynn is actually played by Amanda Hillwood, who goes on to play Lynn in A Very Peculiar Practice. And it's a multiverse because they both die in a car crash at the end of the play.
So A Very Peculiar Practice isn't a prequel then?
Well, you made me think now. Maybe no, it's not. It's interesting because he's married in it, and he's gone off for a dirty weekend with the Lynn character. So it's the same characters, but they're definitely in a parallel kind of world. But Dacre is lacking a certain amount of confidence, whereas Lynn, from memory, is very much a sort of hale and hearty woman who's very confident in her sexuality.
Now, this program doesn't seem to be available anywhere at all. You've seen it though, haven't you? What's it like?
It's funny. I remember it being a funny play, but it's very odd. It's got an odd atmosphere to it. There's lots of kind of people in sort of steam rooms. The frustration about this is the short-lived BBC store where you could buy programs. Actually, Heart Attack Hotel was available on the BBC store and I bought it. But unfortunately, when it closed, they sort of paid you back your money and retracted all of the files because they were sort of digital rights managed. And now it seems it's vanished into the ether completely.
There's an interesting backstory, isn't there, to how A Very Peculiar Practice came to be, because he didn't set out to actually write this originally, did he?
No, and it's interesting because the only other kind of original work he'd done as a series before this was something called Eleanor Marx, which was about Karl Marx's daughter. And then he got commissioned by the BBC to write a multi-part original series about 3 mature women students. And apparently it just didn't work. So he got paid a certain amount up front for it. Interestingly, one of the concerns about the series was it a comedy or was it a drama? Which, you know, is interesting to talk about in the context of Very Peculiar Practice. But apparently the same producer, Ken Riddington, took Davies to the pub, the Bush pub on Shepherd's Bush Green, to break the news that the BBC wasn't going to proceed with it. And that left Davies owing the BBC 17k.
So he had to write something to pay him back.
Well, he could either pay them back, but as
He'd already
he says,
spent the money, I think.
He'd already spent the money.
Yeah.
So it was basically, you know, you write something to clear the debt. And A Very Peculiar Practice was a result of that.
Not that he ever mentions this.
Not that it sticks in his craw. He describes it, particularly within his alter ego character, Ron Russ, as, I somehow became in debt to the BBC for £17,000.
I seem to owe the BBC 17,000 quid for reasons I can't quite understand. So I decided to write off the debt with this little serial, set in a place something like this. Well, you know, the sort of thing. Sharp, satirical, black comedy with a bit of Chekhovian understated pathos.
We should explain, if you haven't seen the series or if you've forgotten, there is an alter ego of Andrew Davies in A Very Peculiar Practice. And he's also part of the Andrew Davies multiverse, which maybe we'll get to a little bit later.
Yeah.
So Ken Riddington, he'd produced quite a few dramas that you might be familiar with. Produced 2 seasons of The Brothers. He produced Tenko. I think he'd worked with Andrew Davies before on To Serve Them All My Days as well, didn't he?
Yeah, he did Serve Them All My Days. He was a bit of a master of the multi-part drama series. He did The Citadel, which is, again, an adaptation of a novel, and it had Gareth Thomas in it and Ben Cross. Did loads of stuff for the BBC. He did future Andrew Davies stuff as well, which we'll probably come on to in a bit. Andrew Davies, effectively, via a work of fiction, describes Riddington as being uncomfortable if something isn't like something else. So he always kind of sort of says, is this Hill Street Blues or is it so-and-so? And it's just like, well, it's like neither. And he looks uneasy at this point. And I think, again, that maybe comes back with A Very Peculiar Practice to, I think, Andrew Davies gently poking fun at Ken Riddington because he's always worried about what is it like. I think we can safely say A Very Peculiar Practice, it's not like much else.
It's not like Hill Street Blues.
It's certainly not.
And also into this story is an old friend of ours, Jonathan Powell.
Sorry, Doctor Who fans, but yeah, Jonathan Powell was very influential. I mean, just the fact that Very Peculiar Practice got commissioned at all, I think, is a lot of that is down to Jonathan Powell wanting to change the type of programs that were being made. But his influence was not just down to being very supportive of the project, which let's add, you know, if Davies was kind of like pushing something out because he owed 17 grand to the BBC, you might look and think, hang on a minute, is this going to be any good? The guy's trying to clear a massive debt, so he might be tempted to just chuck out any old rubbish. But Jonathan Powell was keen and presumably supportive after a failure, you know, after a failure of this other series. The thing he didn't like about it, the one bit that he made a note on, there was Rose, the character that we'll come on to, there was Jock, there was Peter Davison's Stephen Dacre character, but there was another character who's sort of briefly alluded to in the series when it actually comes out, who was a very 70s lecturer who kept sleeping with his patients and who was very much of that kind of free love mindset. And Powell said, don't do that. That makes it very 70s. Why don't you have an 80s character, a Thatcherite character. And of course, that led to the creation of Bob Buzzard, played by David Troughton.
So this is a campus series, and Davis worked for Warwick University. Is it based on Warwick University?
He always denies it. Probably first to say at this point that Neil and I have got a lot of experience at working at universities and experience of other universities.
I blame this program.
Yeah, well, I do as well in a way. Warwick is very much a campus university. It's basically in Coventry, Neil's birthplace. And so he was there a long while. And of course, when the program came out, a lot of people at Warwick were like bragging they were some of the characters that he was basing them on. And he just denies this. At one point, he said, that the people I worked with at Warwick weren't interesting enough to bother adapting into a drama.
I think he's just saying that to get away from the legal ramifications.
I think he is. I mean, he had in mind, he claims, he had UEA, the University of East Anglia, in mind. But UEA wouldn't allow them to film there because they'd been stung by a program which was clearly in everybody's mind at this point, which was The History Man from a few years before, which was based on a 1972 novel by Malcolm Bradbury and was very much based in the 70s. And that's probably what led to Jonathan Powell's note. That would have been something behind it, I think, because The History Man has a sociology lecturer who goes around bedding everything in sight. And it was so controversial, The History Man, in one way or another, that UEA absolutely refused, as did pretty much every other university in the country. So they ended up using a combination of Keele University, which is sort of in Staffordshire, and Birmingham University.
They didn't care.
Well, I think Birmingham didn't care and Keele wanted the money. So it was this kind of weird combination of the two universities, which I guess if you're at either of those universities, you just keep going, oh, well, there's a bit. It must be fun.
I think what's interesting about it is that it would have been so easy for Andrew Davies to create a drama set in the English department of the university, but he decided instead to set it in the doctor's surgery, which is a fascinating idea because it allows all the different departments, all the different lecturers and all the different students to converge on that location. Did he have any medical background at all?
Not that I'm aware of. He sort of said, kind of obviously quite flippantly, but I think there's a lot in it, that he just had a very strong urge to take the piss out of higher education and doctors. Because he always thought doctors were a bit up themselves and he hated their representations on TV as being like these hero figures in Emergency Ward 10, swooping in and solving all of the problems. And he just liked the idea of showing them as a bunch of psychopaths, with one exception. It differentiates it from other campus-based TV programs and novels, indeed, because you've got David Lodge, famous campus novelist, who wrote about the academic community, particularly around English and things like that. As I've mentioned, you have Malcolm Bradbury, sociology, and the kind of university politics. In this, you've got the really strong setting of the doctors, but then they're in the middle of this hellish, both societal and political, with a big P and a small p, context, and it allows you to have a best of all worlds, especially when, okay, David does make many serious points throughout this program, but he is a funny writer and it is a very, very funny piece.
Come and see us anytime, even if you're not ill or paranoid or having a nervous breakdown. Open surgery every Wednesday night. It's a peculiar practice, but, well, we love you.
So you've got a revolving cast of characters who come in and out of the stories, but you've got four main central characters. Peter Davison plays Stephen Dacre, we mentioned already. Now, he's the new guy, just recently divorced, and I think he was a GP, wasn't he, in Wolverhampton? No, Walsall.
That's one of the confusions that happens in the programme, and you've just done it, yes. Yeah, he's based in Walsall, which Davies picked because the population is the illest, or it was at that time, in the country, and second place was Wolverhampton.
He's the everyman figure, isn't he? He's the audience identification figure. He's a lovely guy, basically, but he's got a few hang-ups.
He's got hang-ups. He's just basically splitting up from his wife, who's, amongst other things, has told him it's part of the splitting up that he's never touched her in the right way. So there's a whole sexual thing going on there.
What a surprise.
Yeah, exactly.
And he's played by Peter Davison. Do we know anything about him?
But no. The first thing he was in, apparently, out of the blue, amazing debut. No, I suppose the context of this is so crucial, isn't it? Because he'd just been in Doctor Who, basically.
In fact, I think the only thing he was in between Doctor Who and this was an episode of Magnum P.I.
Yes, that episode of Magnum P.I., the dreadful things when American programs at that time came to Britain. Yes, Davison's in that. There's a whole kind of like country house with lots of English actors playing terrible versions of English characters. I remember it getting a splash all over the tabloids that this was happening. And then I don't think it ever got shown in this country until like years later. I think he'd been in an adaptation of Anna of the Five Towns. But other than that, and I think it must have been quite a twitchy time for Davison because other doctors hadn't fared that well. But Davison always took care to keep making things when he was in Doctor Who. So he did things like Sink or Swim and others. But I imagine that getting a big kind of lead role like this, you know, it got Radio Times front cover on its launch. And it's a big, big thing. And I imagine he heaved a bit of a sigh of relief to make sure that, you know, even though it's a medical man.
Well, he spends the first episode walking around saying, I'm the doctor.
I'm a doctor.
Well, of course you are. This university is full of doctors.
No, I'm a real doctor. A medical man, and I've come to work here as a doctor at this university medical centre.
That's very interesting, Stephen. Tell me now, what makes you think that?
Speaking of doctors, David Troughton's in this, Patrick's son, playing Bob Buzzard. He's the most outwardly hilarious character, I would say. Most of the humour stems from the exploits of Bob.
They do. He's a sort of manic Thatcherite fascist, basically, who sees all of the patients as just getting in the way. He just hates the patients and hates them even more because they're students. And he hates the academics, particularly if they're from the arts and humanities and social sciences side. And so it is partly a way of Andrew Davies getting everything off his chest that he might have ever thought about different disciplines at universities. Bob is really sort of on the verge of a nervous breakdown.
Oh, totally.
Pretty much all the time, because he lives his life encased by regret that he's not making more money somewhere else, and he took these terrible turns in his career.
Loveless marriage with terrible children.
Yes, with these awful children. It's a brilliant tour de force. His only way of kind of exerting what little power he has is to play people at squash. So he's a mildly terrifying character as well as an absolutely hilarious one.
I'll tell you what it's like. It's like a very, very inefficient sector of British industry. Top management are totally corrupt and idle. Middle management are incompetent and idle. And the workforce are bolshy and idle. And of course there's no bloody product. No wonder people get ill here and there's nothing else for them to do.
And then you've got Barbara Flynn playing Rosemary, a character who is so feminist she doesn't actually have a surname. She wasn't the original choice to play this part, I believe.
No, a bit of a mystery there, because there was somebody else was cast and they started making it with her. Then they let her go and got Barbara Flynn in at short notice. I still to this day don't know. I think I even put something out on social media asking if anyone knew.
If you do know, let us know, because it's bugging me. I can't imagine anyone else playing it.
No, well, that's sometimes happens with these last minute recasts, doesn't it? It's like it was meant to be. But from what they were saying in the commentary, and they glossed over it quite quickly, is that Davies got really worried because he thought he'd written a character that was actually unplayable because no one really understood the angle to go with it. And that seemed to be the problem with the original actress. But Barbara Flynn sort of read it and within a day was on it exactly as he wanted it to be.
She basically encapsulates the radical feminist side of universities at that time.
Yeah, through the prism of Andrew Davies's terror. And he basically says she's a combination of all the women that frightened him at university.
You mustn't feel you have to apologise all the time, Stephen. I know it's very difficult to be a man too these days, if you have any sensitivity at all.
Yes, I do find that rather difficult.
I'm sure we're going to work together really well. I'm looking forward to that, Stephen.
Thanks. Well, so am I.
And the fourth person rounding this out is the head of the practice, Jock McCannon, played by the very subtle and underplayed Graham Crowden. He's fantastic.
He is absolutely fantastic in this. I love the fact that, again, on the commentary they mention about Graham was great once we'd calmed him down. Knowing Graham Crowden, he obviously went into it at one pitch, and I think they had to sort of say, turn it down from 11. He was a bit uncontrollable as a character, I think, but they got him under control early on. And once they tamed him a little, they could harness his brilliance, because he is utterly brilliant in it.
I think they cast him because he played a similar part in the film If, didn't he, the history teacher?
That's right. I think it's the only character that Davies asked for someone to play the character because he'd got Crowden in mind. And the character of Jock McCannon is a wonderful thing because knowing a bit as I do about R.D. Lang, the psychiatrist or self-styled anti-psychiatrist, who was massively in vogue in the 60s and rubbed shoulders with Pink Floyd and all of those people as well, and then became hugely discredited towards the sort of 70s and 80s before finally getting struck off. But he had like acolytes. I think there's a film, I still haven't got around to seeing it, where David Tennant plays him actually, Ronnie Lang. And Graham Crowden is clearly devoted. There's a picture of Lang hanging up in his office, but all of those dreams have faded and he's left as an alcoholic. Sexual Anxiety and the Common Cold was his great masterwork.
He's obsessed with sexual anxiety. Everything is related to that. So again, what a surprise. And as the series goes on, he becomes less of a doctor and more like a prophet of doom, doesn't he? Just wandering around, talking into a dictaphone about the end of days.
Yeah, the Old Testament preacher, isn't he? He becomes really in this. But fantastic language and brilliant delivery. I still hear lines from him that still go around in my head all these years later.
You're not joining a happy team. They're trying to get me out. Me first and then you, or just maybe the other way around. We have to keep one jump ahead of them.
Who?
Your colleagues, Black Bob and the Bonnie Wee Lassie. You realise you come into this practice as technically senior to both of them. They're seething with bile, Stephen. It's a mercy they hate each other so much. God knows what it would be like if they ganged up.
And I think most of the greatest scenes in this series are the meetings between those four characters. It's like you're watching a stage play. You know, I'd quite happily sit there for an hour and a half and watch one of those meetings unfurl.
Yeah.
There's quite a few interesting guest characters that come in as well. I think one of the best episodes is the one with Timothy West in it, playing Professor Fury, who's like the angriest lecturer.
I've got an international reputation. Have you got an international reputation?
No, I haven't got an international
It's not worth having an international reputation, you take my word for it. I've got to go to Brazil next month. Who wants to go to bloody Brazil?
So you get all these guest characters coming in, but like I said, most of the dynamics are around those four characters, and also the dynamic between Peter Davison's character and Lynn, who basically helps him get over his touch taboo.
Yes. The sexual politics of Very Peculiar Practice are quite tangled, aren't they? I think,
much, yeah.
because there's a bit of sort of, from Davis's point of view, slightly having your cake and eating it. Though on the other hand, with that, it's supposed to be showing Davison as being an unconfident person who's uncomfortable, but he's also, you know, not sexually threatening. He's willing to go along with what will help him and not be overly aggressive sexually. There's a lot of things in A Very Peculiar Practice where it's set up where characters maybe seem to be representing something that's quite bad, but actually towards the end, or indeed or the better characters in it, but then at the end it's kind of subtly undermined. So it's slightly more ambiguous about that. But there's a sort of slightly uncomfortable thing about Lynn, who's this sporty but extremely highly intelligent kind of expert in body language, who basically sort of magically comes along to cure Stephen of his hang-ups and then melts away again.
When I was young, when I first saw this, I was convinced that she was played by Jenna from Blake 7.
Okay, well, that would have been interesting.
But yeah, I mean, I had a massive crush on her and Barbara Flynn when I first saw this when I was 16.
Everybody was in love with Barbara Flynn. But I mean, I was in love with Barbara Flynn since when she was in Open All Hours, for God's sake. So, you know, there's
Yes. There's lots of great actors in this as well, beyond the four main cast members. There's John Bird playing the VC, Ernest Hemingway. I think he's particularly good in this.
He is. He's excellent. Ernest Hemingway. That's a good joke anyway, isn't it? It's got two M's in it, so that makes it.
There's a early appearance from, maybe the earliest appearance from Hugh Grant.
Yes, Hugh Grant and his regrettable Scottish accent. I can tell you that we were watching that and Shirley screamed with laughter. When he first appeared, it was the shock of him suddenly appearing. And then it was in the accent. It was like, oh my God.
Jesus loves us. Jesus loves every one of us.
Mark Addy's in there.
Yeah.
Playing one of the student union representatives. Kathy Burke plays a student.
Yeah.
In one scene. And Paul Higgins, that you'll probably remember from The Thick of It. He's in a great episode about, well, it's actually like the plot to Kate Bush's song Experiment 4, isn't it?
It
Where
is.
they use sounds to kill people, which is a great episode. And this is the episode where it almost goes into the realm of science fiction, where it looks like the entire university are going to have all their hearing destroyed.
Yeah, Bad Vibrations. It's a really interesting one because basically the university is making sound weapons that will have resonances. Different resonances can destroy different internal organs, which is what they're working on. It's really interesting. I mean, this is in the second series, isn't it? But the very bleak ending because the Paul Higgins character, who out of all the people in the acoustics department, wants to use music, an experiment with music. He basically is just given the job to go and make the arms that will kill loads of people. And he happily goes off. He won't do it with the band because the band would never sell out. But he's happy enough to drive off in his convertible, yeah.
The band that plays in that episode, they're called Slab, and they were a real band, weren't they?
Yeah, John Peel was a fan. And I understand that they've kind of got a reputation in the industrial scene. And of course, the bass player, Bill, was Andrew Davies' son. But weirdly, Davies' son became professor of acoustics at Salford University, which is even mentioned in the programme.
He's not designing weapons, is he?
I think we'll draw a veil over it.
When I first came here, I thought it would all be people like me, playing in noise bands, dedicated to producing new, strange, pure, beautiful sounds. Getting the beauty right into people's bodies, you know? Well, like... Sorry. You've got a lovely low threshold, do you know that?
I don't think this program was designed for 2 seasons, was it? The impression I get at the end of season 1 is that it was wrapped up quite nicely. Season 2 comes along and it's quite awkward, I feel, especially with the way it starts.
Yeah, it's interesting because they had to make a second series because apart from anything else, the critical reaction to the first series, after a few sort of, is this supposed to be a comedy or is it supposed to be a drama reactions, it got increasingly laudatory to the point of, this is easily the best comedy drama there's been for decades. They keep reviewing it again all the way through the series. They don't leave it. And more importantly, as far as the BBC was concerned, it often hit the top of the week for the BBC Two charts. It did so well. It got nominated for the Best Drama BAFTA in one of the all-time great years against Singing Detective and Life and Loves of a She-Devil, which controversially Life and Loves of a She-Devil won. So it was destined, I think. And if you take some of the representations, which I'll talk about in a little bit, about novelizations that Davies did, I think Davies was in two minds about it. And that was manifested by the fact that he got writer's block at this point. He left Warwick University. He obviously decided now the time had finally come where he could become a full-time writer.
Well, his colleagues wouldn't talk to him, would they?
No, exactly. I think the two things are clearly related. And he also said once he got over the block, which he basically got over the block by going and spending about 4 days with the director, talking through ideas. He also said because he'd left Warwick, it freed him up to be more savage because I think you're right. I think he wanted to shake it up by losing Lynn. He wanted to shake it up by Ernest Hemingway going, even though Hemingway had been sort of written out at the end of the first series anyway. But it's such a dark series. It starts right at the beginning, as you say. It's got a homeless Jock McCannon talking about the apocalypse, and that's basically what happens. I think you're spot on with the fact it starts awkwardly. I think it's finding its feet. There's quite a bit of repetition. It's like it's setting itself up for the audience that hadn't watched it, the first series.
When he bumps into Greta for the first time, it feels like it's going to be a rerun of the Lynn relationship.
And that's the risk, isn't it? Because it's basically, one's out and now another one's in. And I was struck by this when I've watched it just recently. But I do think it really picks up after that awkward beginning and goes into a very strong run. I don't think it has quite as strong episodes as maybe the Timothy West one in the first series and the VD one, which we didn't mention, Contact Tracer.
This is pre-AIDS, isn't it, as well?
Yeah.
So everyone's shagging everybody else.
It's interesting. It's like the first series is pre-AIDS and the second series is post-AIDS. And apparently that played into BBC thoughts about what Davies should include and what he shouldn't include into it. But the funny thing about Contact Tracer, the VD episode, is that Jock pulls his act together, becomes this inspirational leader to try and close everything down before it gets to the hospital and destroys the reputation of Lowlands. And he's ultra disciplined. And then as soon as they've succeeded, he just basically says,
I think it's time old Jock went to pieces again.
It's a wonderfully put together episode because it also ends with this terrible, awkward scene where Peter Davison has to go and talk to the VC Ernest Hemingway about the fact he's one of the people passing on, and that's just John Bird and Davison. It's easy to forget how good Davison is in this because he's great, because while he's a timid character to an extent, when he needs to be, he digs his heels in, and he's quite believable in that respect as well, because he's very confident about being a good doctor. I think that's a really important part of it.
I think the first series is perfect. It's all about the characters, whereas the second series seems to be a bit more focused on the politics of the situation. And I'm not entirely convinced. When the apocalypse happens, I don't think the build-up necessarily warrants it. It feels like it needed another season to actually get to that point. Because at the end, it's almost like Doctor Strangelove, isn't it? Where the Vice-Chancellor's gone completely insane. But it doesn't quite work for me. I think it's just a little bit over the top.
Yeah, I think he was trying to do a lot. I think if he'd not dawdled as much maybe in the first 2 or 3 episodes, because we've got the character of George Bunn, the 18th century English literature tutor, played by James Grout. He's a nudist in his own house. George Bunn is this character who's standing up to the authority of Jack Daniels and the evil forces within the university. But he immediately retires and goes back to Oxford because he realizes he's horribly unsuitable as a teacher of English because he doesn't give a damn about what his students think. That's why it's quite interesting, because it undermines it, because he says, why am I? A person like me should not be teaching young people. I think there's some really interesting stuff going on there. But I know what you mean. It turns into a real sort of apocalypse at the end very, very swiftly.
It felt very mean-spirited at the end. There are 2 deaths that sort of come out of nowhere, which I don't like at all. One of them being, well, let's just say it, Jock dies of a massive heart attack because he's trying to save another student who's become sort of a semi-regular in the series.
Sammy Lim, yeah.
They both die, and it's a very, very quick scene where they deal with the death. It's like a year later, and there's a little memorial.
Yeah.
It felt very mean-spirited, that, and the fact that Barbara Flynn's character turns really evil, I would say, makes it very difficult for you to enjoy her as a character as much as you have been doing. And it just felt a little bit mean-spirited to me.
Yeah, I know what you mean. The first series wraps up so nicely with I think the postmodern stuff works really well in it as well, with the Ron Russ characters we've mentioned. He's trying to come up with a series, but reality keeps outdoing him. And it has this conceit about catastrophe theory. Lynn's going to leave to Hendon Police College, but in the end, Hendon Police College ends up moving to Lowlands University and resolving that problem. And it's nicely done. And then, of course, they just had to throw all that away at the start of the second series.
I don't like Greta. She's so annoying to me.
That's quite a common reaction, I think. I'm going to write about this at greater length in the blog that we do about Andrew Davies's novelizations of this, where you have a Ron Russ character inserted. But what you've got in these books is basically a fictionalized representation of the commissioning process of the series, along with the real life Jonathan Powell and Ken Riddington taking him for meals or being at Threshold House at the BBC. And the horror for Rust in the second novel is that Jonathan Powell goes, oh, you know what? I think we want a 3rd series. And the implication is that he writes in that way and kills off the characters and destroys the university. So there's not going to be a 3rd series. And if that's any of kind of Davies's thinking behind it, that's probably why it's done in that way. But no, I know what you mean.
It's still a good series, don't get me wrong. I still really enjoy it. But that first series just seems so perfect to me, the structure of it. I would have been happy if it had just finished there.
The audience definitely tailed off a bit towards the end of the series, but it was shown in February to the beginning of April.
No room left in hell. It's like that.
And it's a bit like that when it starts, isn't it, as well? Because the first scene is basically everybody's crying on the campus. It's kind of so there's a certain consistency to the kind of like the image of the of Lowlands University.
What about the nuns?
Sorry?
The nuns?
Everyone mentions the nuns when they talk about this program. What do we think the nuns represent, John?
I mean, what they come to represent is like the ravens at the Tower of London, isn't it? Jock says that when the nuns leave the pissant swamp, then the university will fall, and that's indeed what happens. Though, of course, you see a 3rd nun, who's actually Rosemary, running off with the nuns at the end. It was obviously a very good thing to put in because everybody talks about them, don't they? That's the thing that's quite funny, because they're on an open air. People who are mercifully too young. There was a program that the BBC put on. It was in the mornings, daytime TV in the mornings, where it would do a post-mortem on the previous night's BBC TV programs. And it was split in 2 parts across another program, probably the Time, the Place discussion program. Some people who worked at the BBC thought this was a really stupid idea to do this programme, and they called it Open Wound.
It's hosted by the fantastic Eamon Holmes.
Oh, but it's a sort of wince-making programme. I used to watch it religiously, even though I always absolutely despised it.
It's a very awkward instalment, the one with Eamon Holmes and Andrew Davies, where he basically tells Andrew Davies to his face that he thinks the programme's too weird.
Gentlemen, I could put a damper on it. I thought it was completely, as we would say in Belfast, wired up.
What's
on a different plane. I mean, last night was the first time I had actually seen it. So I reckon with this programme you're at a disadvantage if you haven't seen the first series, or you're not in the medical profession or at university or whatever, and you suddenly come into it halfway through the second series.
He started as he meant to go on, didn't he, Holmes? Really consistent twat all the way through his career. Yeah, he just doesn't like it. Then he hasn't watched it before, has he? And it's going in about 3 episodes into the second series. Yeah, you just get some little gems in it. You know, that's why it was worth watching. Like, you'd have people like Alan Clark having just directed, and it'd been shown the night before, you know, Elephant, the one where someone goes around in Northern Ireland, and then you'd get like Mrs. So-and-so ringing up. It was wince-making to watch at times, but it was just, you know, it was something about TV.
Now, here is a good point. Carolyn Birch from Leicester. Who else have we got? Duncan Fawkes of Plymouth. Margaret Kane of Chapel-on-le-Firth. John Gutteridge of Sudbury. Graham Paris of Edinburgh. James McCabe of Glasgow. And Jane Rowland from Eastbourne. You may wonder what they all want to know.
I bet I know.
What?
I'm not going to ask about the nuns, are
They're
they?
going to ask about the 2 nuns that appear constantly in this programme. Now, who are these 2 nuns, and what are they doing there?
Well, I don't know either. I mean, I wrote them, but I don't really know.
And that wasn't the end of it either. There was an actual bona fide spin-off that came a couple of years later, this time on BBC One, shot entirely on film and on location, I believe, in Poland. It was called A Very Polish Practice. And it was a spin-off where it featured Stephen and Greta living together, and also Bob appears bizarrely as well. It's nothing like the series, is it, John?
No, it's not. I mean, they obviously set up the Polish bit at the very end of the second series by mentioning that Stephen and Greta were moving to Poland. But it's a very odd piece of work. It's basically set in sort of Poland, which is gradually having kind of capitalism coming into the kind of the post-communist era, and Dacre's working in a hospital. I suppose the nearest parallel to the series is you've got creeping market forces, capitalism coming into the university, and here you've got it coming in to the hospitals in Poland. Firstly, as you mentioned, Bob Buzzard has gone over to Hamburger. He's left Lowlands finally, and he's working for Hamburger, the supplier of medical equipment, and he's over there as a salesman. Coincidentally bumps into Stephen Dacre at a medical kind of convention, exhibition, whatever. But it's mainly kind of taken up with the Alfred Molina, Greta, Dacre love triangle.
Yeah, it's just awful.
But as I understand it, that's based on a large element of Joanna Kanska, the actor who played Greta's actual life story. There's a newspaper interview with her from the time where she doesn't want to elaborate too much because she doesn't want to kind of take away from what Andrew Davies added to it. But she told him her life story, and he basically incorporated tons of it into this program. And in the end, it's just a very, very different piece of work. Would that story have been made if it didn't have a very peculiar practice sort of name to get it made? I sort of doubt it.
The new big thing in Eastern Europe will be private clinics. Oh, not like the old days, perks for the party bosses, no. There'll be luxury clinics for the new rich, paid for with real money by the actual customers. Now that's a novelty. Overseas trade as well. Plastic surgery. Come to Poland looking like a sack of potatoes, go home looking like an Aston Martin.
I miss the fact that they don't have those studio-bound multi-camera stage-like conversations anymore. It's lots of on-location work, which should in theory be better, but I feel it took away from the flavour of the actual programme itself, and the ending is very unsatisfactory. And again, Greta is just so annoying. I just love Lynn too much. That's the problem. And the whole coincidence of Bob turning up as well. It just feels like he'd have been better off, like you say, maybe doing it as a standalone thing.
Yeah, exactly. It wasn't as if Davies wasn't doing it, his own original stuff post Very Peculiar Practice, but this seems slightly inconsequential. It's a disappointment.
We've already spoken about the Andrew Davies multiverse, and it doesn't stop here, does it? Ron Rust appears in another programme.
Yeah, he does. It's part of a series of plays called Stages on BBC Two, which I quote, a series of plays designed specifically for the medium of television, which is quite handy when it's a TV play, I suppose. It was 94, so it's a deliberate harkening back to using videotape, putting on the kind of plays that you might have seen in the 70s and early 80s. And it was called A Few Short Journeys of the Heart. It's a very odd piece.
Pretentious, I think's the word.
Yeah, it's interesting because there was a collection of short stories that Davies wrote called Dirty Faxes. And what this play is really just a sort of quite half-arsed attempt to draw together a number of those stories from Dirty Faxes. And it basically has Ron Russ, in this case, played by David Troughton rather than Joe Melia. And Russ loosely draws the stories together. But recently at a Doctor Who convention, some friends of mine mentioned that David Troughton was being asked about other work that he'd been in. And he went on to tell a tale about how he was traumatised by this Andrew Davies play he was in, where he played a character who started cumming mints. And as soon as they mentioned this on social media, I went, I know that play. I've seen that play.
I want to weave a great, complex, semi-magical narrative about sexuality, identity, dreams, technology, and the universal search for love. Bunwell meets Altman in the labyrinth of dreams. I want to call it Journeys of the Heart.
Is this wise, Ron? I don't want to be unkind, but don't you think you'd feel more comfy with another couple of episodes of Inspector Grimm?
Nadia!
The interest of Dirty Faxes is that it has got a whole short story which is not included in that play, set at Lowlands University in the Ernest Hemingway years. And then a pretty good short story in that collection was also left out of A Few Short Journeys of the Heart, which became a screen 1 or 2 called Ball Trap on the Côte Sauvage, which is actually quite a good original work by Davies. But yeah, the play is not very successful.
Didn't he co-write Game On?
Yeah, Game On's that interesting one, isn't it? Because shamefully can't remember the name of the co-author. It was a woman, wasn't it? Who he worked on Game On. And I was never quite sure exactly what he devised it, didn't he, I think, which is, and maybe wrote a few of them.
He wrote the first 2 series, I think.
Oh, did he?
Or
He
co-wrote the first 2 series.
Yeah, that's right, yeah. If you mention Andrew Davies nowadays, what everybody knows him for are adaptations, and quite often literary adaptations.
Pride and Prejudice being the most famous, I'm guessing.
As I say, he turned some not particularly great works, like Mother Love, for example, into a very successful Diana Rigg. And no one, I think, would call the original novel of House of Cards a particularly great piece of work. But Andrew Davies made it what it is. And when they did the US House of Cards, Davies gets a big credit on that because they basically adapted that rather than the original book. You mentioned Pride and Prejudice, but even throughout his career, he could come up with some great stuff. I mean, there's a brilliant version, I thought, of War and Peace. Before that, he did a really good Bleak House when they put it on twice a week, half-hour episodes, which worked really well, got a real buzz about them.
Other great literary works like Bridget Jones's Diary.
Yes, exactly. When someone asked him years ago on a cult BBC interview, will there be more Very Peculiar Practice? And he just said, I have no more plans to do that. And when you consider that he got writer's block before the second series, a man less likely to have writer's block, it's hard to imagine when you consider the stream of sort of annual 2-yearly, 3-yearly works by Davies. It's clear that he moved on to other areas, and, good luck to him, because some of those adaptations are fantastic TV.
If people want to watch A Very Peculiar Practice, it's quite difficult, isn't it? It's not streaming anywhere, is it, John?
No, it's not. When it came to DVD, they brought the first series out on DVD, and then there was silence for quite some time. Nothing happened. And then finally Network, the old DVD company, got hold of the rights to do the lot, and they brought out everything. But it's noticeable that there's no commentaries on the second series. Those commentaries were done for the original release. That's your lot, really. You have to get hold of that. It was great to watch again just because of the fact that it hits so funny still. That's the thing that I find really amazing. The characters are so good. The acting, performances are just astonishing, and they kind of live on, don't they, those characters? That's the thing, that it's rare that you get something that's quite that strong, and really was, apart from maybe a few quibbles at the first episode, was recognized by everyone, including the viewers.
Yeah, it also feels very accurate to the location it's in, because we've both worked in academia, haven't we? And I feel that, well, first of all, when I first saw a very peculiar practice. I was just about to go to university, so I was very excited. I thought this is going to be a magical place full of weirdos. And then I worked at university for 20 years, and they were absolutely right. It is a magical place full of weirdos. And this is the first time I've watched it where I don't have a connection to university, and it made me really pine for those days, made me feel quite sad, really.
It's interesting, yeah. I mean, I went to university not long after it, and I guess it's quite funny though. We watch something where all the students are quite miserable, and then we think, "Oh, how exciting! We're going to a place like that as well." But no, that definitely fed into why I liked it so much. I think because I was just about to go to university. I still work in HE. It's funny, you know, the more things change, the more things stay the same. Some of the stuff, particularly in the first series, about international students and getting the kind of campuses over here. I mean, it's just the same now. And it has just gone further. And people who were thinking it was a really exaggerated thing. There's a great bit at the end of the last episode of the first series is really excellent, where they have this brilliant character, another incidental, brilliant character called Pretty Man. He's basically doing a review to make 25% cuts at the university. And there's just this great bit where the Vice-Chancellor says something like, because he mentions polytechnics, and the Vice-Chancellor, Ernest Hemingway, says, well, hardly comparable. I think that's such a great line which still stands. How can you possibly compare a university to a polytechnic?
If you start saying that, you may as well say that the lecturers are here to teach their students.
Actually, I thought they were, Bob.
Notionally, yes, notionally, hypothetically. But in reality, they're here to avoid contact with the students as much as possible while they write books and articles no one's going to read and swan off to conferences to give papers no one's going to listen to. And the more of that they do, the more time off they get to do even more of it until they get so eminent there's no danger of them ever having to see another student.
What happens to Peter Davison? Did he go on to anything else?
He just went, really. I think, you know, it's sad. It's a great legacy to him that he vanished without a trace. Yeah, Davison immediately after this did the series called Campion, which lasted for 2 series, but they ran out of money to make it. It was apparently doing quite well in the States, I think. And I guess that Davison had one of those things that all kind of good actors or those kind of character actors can sometimes fall into, where he had a bit of a dip. But then he came back really strong, didn't he, with things like The Last Detective and starring roles on ITV again. So
that Braithwaite's program that he was in.
That was his big kind of comeback moment, wasn't it? I remember bumping into him in Virgin Megastore CD section in London in about 1996. It would have been a bit. And it was just when he was having that dip, and he was in something on the West End, so it wasn't exactly terminal. I just thought he looked quite sad. I would have walked over to him, but I felt it was the one time in Peter Davison's career where I felt a bit awkward talking to him, because he's been like an endlessly successful actor, but I just thought, oh, he's having a bit of it. He's not been on the telly for a couple of years, kind of thing.
You caught him on an off year.
Exactly. It was like really unlucky time to kind of, I was on the opposite CD thing, pretending to look at the CDs, but staring at Peter Davison.
Yeah, you should hear what he thought of you.
Exactly.
Okay, John, what are we doing next week?
We're doing Harry's Game, the stirring tale of MI5 undercover men going to try and track down an IRA assassin.
With that guy from Casualty.
The guy from Casualty and the guy from The Sandbaggers.
And until next time, I've been Neil.
And I've been John.
And you've been listening to The World of Telly.
Wants to go to bloody Brazil.